So just to ask both of you, why do writers choose to use persona or archetypal figures?
My answer is yes.
Good, thank you. So why would we choose to do it? I think many, well, no, I don't know as many of you as I thought I would, so I can tell my same story that I've told a million times. Sorry, Michael.
Love to hear it every time.
I originally chose to use persona. First of all, I was influenced by Bill. As I said, he was my teacher, and I really loved the King Kong poems that he had written, and I thought, I never thought that I would be able to write in a mask or to use any kind of character. I was really into it must be autobiographical and just straightforward and all these things, and I didn't want to deal with surrealism or masks or anything like that. And as I started trying to write about some very difficult subject matter, I realized that every time I started writing about it, it just turned out to be a rant, or it wasn't art. It was not turning into a beautiful form. It just was a kind of a mess. And my first chapbook, well, my only chapbook, which is back there for sale, the Red Riding Hood Papers, the use of that fairy tale allowed me to enter into that emotional territory in a way that I would not have been able to had I not used that barrier of the persona of Red Riding Hood and several other personas that I use in the chapbook, such as the grandmother's bed, for instance, allowed me to go more deeply into the emotional subject matter and express the emotions that I needed to express more honestly. So that is how it has worked for me.
Well,
this is what moderators do.
Yeah, I suppose one of the main motivations for me was that you get to be somebody else. It's kind of like somebody who likes to be an actor. It's a chance to sort of project yourself into some other person or creature. And I suppose the Kong poems are the first whole series of persona poems I wrote, but I bumped into it every once in a while. I think when I wrote a poem about a Nazi war criminal who horrified and interested me, and wrote a poem from his point of view, a persona poem where the Nazi war criminal is doing the speaking, and partly as a way of trying to understand how people like that think, or how they could possibly exist on this planet, and it's a way of sort of probing into a truth from a slightly less direct way than just confronting it head on. That's one reason I did. The other is it's a lot of fun just to change yourself into somebody else, and sometimes you can say things that you couldn't say, as a poet. He said it, I didn't say it. So that's always fun too, I think, and I've always found that it sort of helps me discover things, surprise myself, and things that Robert Frost said, if a poem doesn't surprise the poet, it's not going to surprise the reader. And if it doesn't surprise the reader, it's going to be a dead poem. So it's kind of helped me, carried me along and helped me do that a little more easily sometimes. Yeah, I like to write persona. I don't write them all the time, but I find them a very useful tool in the toolbox.
I'd like to add to that, using, with Bill's Kong poems, and then the Red Riding Hood things that I've been writing, there's a great freedom in not having to explain everything and using just the sheer weight of the narrative that's already been written to carry so much along. And so that's a great freedom that you can just draw on, the old Kong movie and the stuffed toy kind of thing, or, the story about the grandmother's going to be eaten. So everybody kind of has these things in our minds, and you can use that very powerfully so you don't have to explain things. It just carries that weight.
So
already.
For Bill, Kong, and for Shanan, Red Riding Hood,
I'm wondering what those two kind of stories, what did they mean to you that you kind of centered on those?
Kong is another archetype. Kong is a version of what, well, X.J. Kennedy, the poet, wrote a wonderful article a long time ago called Who Killed King Kong, where he was trying to explain why this particular horror movie figure has existed, you know, decades after most horror figures are forgotten about. There are only a few that hang around, but there have been jillions of horror movies made, and you know, you have Dracula, Frankenstein, Kong, and a few handful of others. And in Kong's case, at any rate, he argues that Kong is a version of the what he calls the pitiable beast archetype. That is, a creature who is born with an exterior that terrifies or disgusts or revolts people, and yet has a beautiful soul inside, who means well and loves people, but is always misunderstood because he looks like a terrible, horrible thing that's going to hurt somebody. So you know, the Beast and Beauty and the Beast is another version of this, and in fact, you've seen the original Kong movie. It starts with an epigraph from Beauty and the Beast, and the last line of that when Kong is like splat on the below the Empire State Building, the last line is "'Twas Beauty killed the Beast." So they're hammering that similarity. But you can also talk about Quasimodo, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, the same thing. Cyrano de Bergerac is a little bit of a version of that, the guy with the huge nose, who's the great lover and the brilliant speaker who can't get Roxanne's attention because he has this funny-looking appearance. And again, you know, as Dino De Laurentiis once said about Kong, "It's beautiful, it's lovely." And yeah.
What drew you to it?
I guess what partly drew me to it was the movie was kind of lost after it came out. It was revived in the middle 1950s when I was a kid, and I went to the picture show and got to see him on the giant screen, and it just blew me away. I'd never seen anything like that, and it sort of stuck with me. And you know, like the series evolved. One day I was having writer's block, and so I assigned myself an exercise, which is to write an animal poem. And I thought, wolf, no. Let's see, eel, no. Fox, no. I've seen a lot of that stuff, and I wound up with Kong, who's not even an animal, but that sort of you know, the childhood hook and the sort of vast emotional appeal, I think, because as I said, this is a disguised form of a figure that is rooted in the human psyche, I think, and all of us are Kong in a sense of the people could see how beautiful I am inside. You know, if it weren't for this body, how high I could jump and how beautiful I could dance. You know, that sort of thing. We all have that to more or less extent, and so there's this, which is what makes Kong keep living. You know, Kong is, even though there's not a Kong movie out now, you see, past the fireworks stand, there's a giant Kong balloon there, and one of my students who worked in a family planning clinic brought me a package of King Kong condoms with the Mighty 8 ones everywhere. So for all those reasons, I sort of settled on it.
It's a good question, Rob. Thanks for asking. I was drawn to the Red Riding Hood tale partly because I was a little confused by who's at fault in that tale. Obviously, we can just blame the wolf, but the mother sends the daughter out. The daughter, goes and does what she's not supposed to do, which is pick flowers and talk to strangers, and then the grandmother is sometimes killed, and sometimes it comes back to life, and I just was thinking as I was writing about these emotional experiences I referred to had to do with an abuse cycle, and it seemed to me, and my grandmother was very, very important to me in my life, and was kind of a person that would go and stay at her house constantly, and she was very important. And I just thought about the loss of her and feeling like whose fault, and just the complicity of all of it in an abuse cycle, forgiving someone and then going back. And so I just started thinking about all the different ways that that tale could be told, and just started exploring it. But it was based on that idea of, you know, small girl, grandmother, and some kind of predator, and that's kind of where it started. But then I've tried to expand it.
What restrictions or problems can occur with the use of persona?
Well, obviously, you have the restrictions of talking like a 50-foot gorilla and sounding, in Kong's case, or whatever character you have the restrictions of that voice and that mentality, you know. You might be talking about someone who's not an English major, you know, when you're creating that persona, and you have to sort of remodel your mind a little bit to become that character. And it's kind of like method acting, I guess. You have to sort of get yourself deeply into that, but you are restricted, therefore, on the things you can say and how you can say them, and you have to stick with a voice that is convincing, however fake it is. You know, it's like in acting, you got to make people kind of believe that they're hearing Kong speak, and so yeah, there are those restrictions, but once again, sometimes restrictions free you up to do things that you might not otherwise do. You know, it always sort of ties in with me. You know, Richard Wilbur, the great American poet who wrote in form always and all the way through the pre-verse era, and was often sort of faulted for not being with it, not being hip and writing in pre-verse. Was asked, you know, why are you writing this terribly restrictive form that some of the, you know, at the height of the hostility toward formal verse that was sometimes associated with fascism. You know, you're a fascist, you know, and he said, well, for me, it's not restrictive. It liberates me, because when I hit the end of a line, have to hit a rhyme and have to hit meter, the easy word that I might have been thinking of doesn't come, and I'm forced to think of something that I might not have even, you know, bothered to do. So I see that as a kind of liberating force. Other people feel restricted by it, but for me personally, it frees me from the easy, lazy word, and which is something you always want to avoid if you're writing a good poem. So yeah, what's a limitation is sometimes also, you know, the other way around.
I think one of the biggest dangers is choosing some kind of a well-known tale or myth or something like that, and just, again, not surprising the reader, and just falling back and retelling the same story without adding anything new to it. I think that's one of the biggest dangers. Is, you know, I could write writing the poems and just retell the story the same way it's already been told, and what good does that do? You know, I might say it in a beautiful way, but it doesn't add anything to the story, or it doesn't add anything emotionally. And so I would say, and we've talked about this in some of my classes at USU to my students. Just have to be really careful to add, you know, what are we adding to that particular myth or that fable or that fairy tale, and how are we, you know, changing it in some way so that it's not just being retold, and then it can actually surprise ourselves. You should surprise yourself when you write a poem.
Go ahead.
It feels like that the characters that you chose were initially static, and then you expanded their personalities by writing about the experiences in which they had. And so my question is, at what point did you really decide that maybe you've exhausted this concept? At what point did you decide that, okay, I've written everything that I can write about King Kong and Red Riding Hood?
Right. Just in case anyone heard, the question is, at what point did it feel like everything about that character could be written, that that character was basically exhausted?
Well, you never want to go to the well too often on something like this, and it can be exhausted, at least for you. And for me, in the case of the Kong poems, I wrote about half of them, and then I felt I was, you know, I was out of material, and I didn't want to just start repeating myself, you know, Kong goes to Japan or something. And, so I quit and went on to do something else, because I thought that was it. And then 15 years later, Kong came back to me, and so I wrote a bunch more. But right now, you know, I feel like I've done as much as I'm wanting to do with Kong, but who knows? So I'm never quite clear when it's exhausted. It can be exhausted temporarily, and then things can kind of build up, and you know, it pops out again. So not a clear line on that.
I don't think that the stories can ever really be exhausted, because I think that, you know, there's just so many things inside of them and so many things we can continue to look for, but it just comes when the poet or the writer, novelist, whatever, just gets sick of that place. And so and the same exact thing happened to me as to Bill. I said, you know, I finished my Red Riding Hood poems probably I finished that chapbook in 2009 probably, and then I didn't write another Red Riding Hood poem until last summer. They just started coming back, and you know, now I'm just looking at a different character, and so it just, the grandmother character is really important to me to start exploring at this point, but now I'm getting sick of it again, so it's been about a year and a half, and I just feel like, oh, I've got to move in a new direction, but I believe that it will come back. I think that it will. There's just too many things inside of it.
Well, picking up on what Shannon said, one reason I guess we've settled on these characters is that the stories themselves are so rooted, you know, subconsciously, unconsciously in the human psyche. Not Kong, but that pitiable beast archetype, and the Red Riding Hood figures are so hooked so deeply that they're always probably going to be all these permutations that come out. It's just the poet gets, you know, loses track of them for a while. But they're both very rich minds to vein, I think, as opposed to some other characters that you might pick. And they've both kind of been along for ages and ages, and there are good reasons for that probably, and so that's, I guess, why we keep going back to